welcome to our third lecture, a lecture about writing and also critical reading in the humanities. We're so lucky today to have Professor Mariëtte Willemsen with us. Professor Willemsen is a professor of philosophy here at AUC, and she'll tell us a little bit about herself and a little bit about how she does her work. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Dawn, for having me in your wonderful series. I feel flattered that you invited me.
What do you teach here at AUC? And how did you become a philosopher?
Oh, well, these are two separate questions, though somewhat related, of course. I teach philosophy courses at AUC on the philosophy track, ethics currently, and philosophical controversies, a course on modern philosophical texts. That's sort of rotating between texts, currently on a philosopher, Simone Weil. So I move around on the philosophy track, and I came to AUC almost at the start of this wonderful school, some 10, 11 years ago. Before that time, I was located at VU University, not far away. I'm a very local person, as you can maybe hear from my accent. How I came to be a philosopher, it's a gradual process. My mother used to tell me that I was making things very complicated all the time. That's maybe a sign of being a philosopher. And I started to study linguistics, Dutch linguistics and literature. And at some point I became more and more interested in philosophy, because I took one course and then thought, oh, wow, this is the place to be for me. So it was a gradual process to, also connections between literature and philosophy, between language and philosophy. There are many connections, of course, between the fields. So that's also where my interest lies, sort of between language, literature, and philosophy. Yeah.
So maybe you'll tell us a little bit about how you came to write in philosophy, maybe the paper that you were going to tell us about, perhaps?
Yeah, of course, it comes with a discipline to write. It's the best way, I'd say. Well, yeah, probably the best way to really think about what your thoughts are and to spell them out, and also in conversation with others. It's sort of great conversation of humankind to write. You asked me to focus on a specific paper, and I thought maybe a more recent one. I'm not a very prolific author. It's not that I publish all the time. We also don't have time to do that. Would be nice though, but I really profit from the teaching. So we also do it at AUC, that there's a sort of connection between teaching and research. And the paper that you asked me, or that I proposed to talk about, is on a philosopher and novelist, Iris Murdoch. And she is currently among, let's say, my little group of favorite philosophers. And already the fact that she's a novelist and philosopher, I'm finding very intriguing. I started to work on her I would say some 20 years ago, 15 years ago maybe. Going to conferences, reading her work, and yeah, it is indeed 20 years ago, because the first project I did on Iris Murdoch was a translation of 3 of her most famous essays. And I think I'm finding translating a very important exercise, and more than an exercise. And I would say that a lot of my research is very much related to the skill of interpreting, translating, commenting, and I'm finding that super important for a philosopher. Well, she is, as said, a novelist and a philosopher. She's no longer alive. She died, when was it? Some 20 years ago. She was very famous, and is sort of getting re-famous now especially for her novels. She wrote 27 novels, and I'm sad to say that I read them all. it's sad because there's no longer a novel that I can read. I start rereading them. They're fantastic novels because they have a lot of philosophy in them, but not in an annoying way. You sometimes have those literary artists who really are sort of showing off with their philosophical knowledge, and with her it's more implicit. You sort of start to recognize certain thoughts, certain ideas. And when I first read her novels, it's a long time ago, I didn't know that she was also a philosopher. So that came later. And then I reread many of her novels in the light of her philosophical theories. And although she herself says that philosophy and literature are very distinct disciplines, I do not fully trust her there. I would say that she puts her philosophy to the test in her novels.
Can you tell us, when you say philosophy, I think some of us might not know what you mean by that.
Yeah, well, that's a podcast in itself, of course, because the whole the question what philosophy is part of philosophy itself all the time. People keep getting back to it. What is philosophy? Well, I'm especially interested in moral philosophy, about what it means to live a good life. And what I value in Murdoch, that she asks this question in a very explicit way. So she asks, different from some other philosophers. We had just had an ethics class about this, that there is a branch in ethics called virtue ethics. And I'm attracted to that asks not so much about what is the theory of the good, what is a sort of procedure to act in a good way, or to do good deeds, but more like, how can we make ourselves morally better? How should we live? What does the good life look like? And Murdoch is one of the, a group of philosophers that started to go back to these sort of ancient questions that were being asked by Aristotle and also by Confucius. So we wanted to go back to these type of questions instead of working with a sort of moral calculus or focusing on rationality. So what philosophy is, it's a broad question, and you can of course point to certain disciplines, to aesthetics, talking about what is beauty, what is the sublime, or you could go for more epistemological questions, ask about knowledge, can we be certain of things, and how can we be certain of things, or the deeper metaphysical questions. I tend to focus on more ethical matters as an important subdiscipline in philosophy.
And did you do that in this paper that you wrote that you want to talk to us about?
Yes, well, what it is that I'm doing there, let me show you the book, because it is a paper that is included in a book on Iris Murdoch. It's edited by two philosophers who are doing a lot of work in the field of Murdoch, Nora Hemmerlein and Gillian Dooley. And the book has a nice revealing title. It is called Reading Iris Murdoch. Metaphysics as a Guide to Morals. That's a subtitle to unpack, I'd say. So metaphysics as a guide to morals. The subtitle is, that doesn't really explain the whole matter, but the subtitle is referring to a book, a philosophical book, a voluminous book by Murdoch. It's falling a bit apart, that's nice. And the book is called Metaphysics as a Guide to Morals. And it's a very dense book. I think originally lectures, and then at some point in the 80s, early in the 80s, it was published. And people are not so much reading this book as well as the earlier essays that I translated with a colleague from Glasgow, now in London. And the book is not, it's in a way not a good read. It's so dense, there's so much to explain, that at some point some people who were working in Murdoch studies thought it's time for a book about this book to explain what she's doing there. And then I was asked to focus on, there are 11 chapters, I think. Let me check. On a specific chapter. No, there are more, there are even 19 chapters. And each and every author was asked to interpret one of the chapters, or sometimes two. And I was asked to focus on chapter 3, and chapter 3 is on the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, dedicated to Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer is also being related to in other chapters, but it's full focus in the third chapter. So what I do is trying to indeed read that chapter, explaining it, exploring it, asking questions about it, and trying to make sense of it. And there my AUC teaching career turned out to be very helpful, because in the past I taught a course on Arthur Schopenhauer. So for me, it was a chance to profit from the course and all the coursework done with the students to explain how Murdoch interprets Schopenhauer's ethical philosophy. And what she does there is it's a close reading of Schopenhauer, but at the same, a close reading is never so close that there's not one's own vision. So she tries to understand this ethical theory, and Schopenhauer is being known for his pessimism. And the first thing she tries to argue for is that is in a way not fully true, or at least you would need an adjective to explain his pessimism. She calls him a cheerful pessimist.
I can relate.
And she's right about that, because Schopenhauer, he is a pessimist. He talks about suffering. He talks about, well, the very last word of his famous book, The World as Will and Representation, the very last word is nothing. And sometimes it looks as if he's writing the whole book to finally, after 600 pages, say nothing. That's the meaning of life. It's nothing. And in that sense, he's a pessimist. But his style is so indeed cheerful. And he gives so many examples. And he has a very beautiful, accessible style. And it's in all its grim aspects, it indeed cheers you up. And in general, pessimism cheers me up more than optimism. Optimism can be very, I don't know.
Burdensome.
Yeah, indeed. Oh, no.
Yeah.
It's too optimistic.
So it's interesting because our students just finished writing what we call a lens essay, where they interpret one text through the lens of another. So you might say, what is Iris Murdoch's theory of Schopenhauer? That's what she's doing, right? She writes a theory of Schopenhauer. What is Schopenhauer up to? Iris Murdoch will say something about this. But you are now doing your theory of what Murdoch is doing with Schopenhauer. So this is really interesting.
Another lens, yeah.
Yes. So this is going to be useful to us as thinkers, I think, in our AWS, where we're thinking about joining academic conversations. What are the conversations? How do we join them, right? And our next goal is to frame our own conversation in a discipline. Some of us will do that in philosophy, some of us neuroscience. It will depend on the person. But what you managed to do here is my question, really. Like, how did you come up with something to say about Murdoch's work with Schopenhauer? About what did you argue, or what did you?
Well, I'm trying to understand her ethical stance in a way. So I said that she asked this virtue ethical question about how to live the good life. What she does is she's trying to see what Schopenhauer is doing as in his main work, and I should say a little bit about his main work, not too long. He offers a grand theory, probably one of the last grand theories. Philosophers used to do that, write a theory about everything. That's no longer the case. People just focus on small epistemological questions. I'm, by the way, attracted to people doing that. Say, okay, I'll write about everything. He starts to unfold his theory about the stuff of the world, and has a wonderful theory about aesthetics, about what good art can do. And then finally, he develops a moral system. The interesting thing about his moral system is that he sees compassion as the cornerstone. of ethics. And that is related to how he sees the world. He feels that everything is connected. And if everything is connected, compassion is sort of natural virtue, so to speak. So in explaining what she finds attractive, I get a better sense of Murdoch's stance, but also, I should say, of my own stance, trying to understand it better. And what I try to argue for is that Murdoch herself, in the context of the whole book, because this is only one chapter, is trying to propose a certain ethical system that is a mix of indeed this virtue ethics built around the virtue of compassion and a type of mild duty ethics. Duty ethics is a rather reason-based, rigid way of doing ethics, but she unfolds a more mild way of doing duties and relates to what we do as educators or as parents, also educators. That you would just say, not in a rigid way, not with a categorical imperative, but would say something like, oh, don't do this. Or, no, maybe don't steal. Or look at this. You would have all sorts of mild imperatives that give a sense of that we have certain maybe obligations, not by the law or not by a certain, through a religious framework, although that could also be the case, that could work well. But that's something that is given from the start. And I would say this leads her to an interesting combination of trying to be a good person and trying to follow certain, well, maybe almost mystical advices. So there's a bit of mysticism in Murdoch and also in Schopenhauer, but that's not a mysticism that is going beyond and beyond, but very down to earth. Yeah, I'm not sure if that is.
No, that's really
makes sense.
That's very interesting. What I'm thinking of is how in both the science, the neuroscience, and the anthropology lectures, people have talked about sifting through many sources to make sense of their data, right? So, maybe like 50 to 100 different academics thinking about this particular issue in various ways. And what I hear you talking about, if I'm correct, is doing a very close reading of Murdoch's reading of Schopenhauer. And that's your work in this chapter. That you don't introduce a lot of other voices, that you really try to carefully listen to what these two are doing, what Murdoch is doing with Schopenhauer. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct. Of course, I'm now thinking of the notes and the references there.
Show us.
There is an overseeable list of references, let's say 2, 4, 6, 10 or so.
All right. Okay. Yes.
That's not a lot, because it was also because that was the task to read Murdoch, explain her, and of course, I brought in. I had to bring in the sources of Schopenhauer, and there's a bit of historical work to do there.
Yeah.
It might be interesting because the sources, the translations Murdoch was working with are not the translations we are currently working with. And that is where you need some time to see, okay, what is the Schopenhauer source that she was using? She was using a translation, well, there are, I think, some 4 translations from German into English, and it's very interesting in itself, which is why I'm attracted by translations and what they do, and how it's interesting to compare them and to get a better sense of the of what, maybe if that's not too old-fashioned, intention of the author. But she was working with a translation called The World as Will and Idea. The German says, Die Welt als Wille und Vorstellung. Vorstellung is sometimes translated as idea and sometimes as representation. And there's a whole debate around what would be the best way to understand Schopenhauer. And the fact that she was working with this translation has a certain effect on her interpretation. So that is this is the sort of historical aspect of working on this article. Then to use this translation and to check how she relates to her sources. She sometimes doesn't do footnotes. Then you think, okay, what is she relating to here? You could say it's sloppy work. We as AUC students and teachers would not be allowed to not mention our sources. We know she's working with The World as Well an Idea, but sometimes I think, is this a quote or what is she doing here? So that was also part of the job, to find out what she was referring to.
And can you tell us a little bit about how you constructed the essay, like how you wrote this piece?
Yeah. I thought at some point I really wanted to do the close reading, but of course I started to introduce. There's an overall introduction, introducing Arthur Schopenhauer as one of the philosophical heroes of this book, and I say something about his main work and how she refers to it. I already say something about her use of the translation. And then at some point, well, as you tend to do an introduction, where this is my main point, I will start off with a summary. This is the structure. Start off with a summary. I will highlight crucial aspects. And at some point, I will refer to some other chapters because they include some interesting material not included in the specific chapter. And at some point, I would like to so that's maybe the main point that is not directly in the source, because you also want to add something to the conversation. Of course, it's fun to comment, and I really think it's very important in philosophy. But at some point, I want to argue for the claim that Schopenhauer, through a reading of Murdoch, it is possible to attune Schopenhauer's sort of sometimes shallow empiricism to a deeper kind of mysticism.
Interesting.
So, in a way, it's a sort of down-to-earth type of mysticism that I'm trying to explain through a reading of Murdoch. So that's sort of going a little bit beyond the chapter itself. It's a fun thing that I felt I should add.
Yeah, that's your theory that you developed of it, like how it's what you're teaching your reader about.
Yeah,
Is
that
right?
Yeah, and I'm now thinking of, because I was referring to the teaching practice, and one of the probably most wonderful moments in teaching the Schopenhauer course was, and I'm referring to that section of Schopenhauer's book in this article, is at some point we were talking about the Pythagoras theorem, and Schopenhauer writes about that and says, well, there is a very, very complex proof to prove the Pythagoras theorem, a Euclidean type of very long, logical, spelled out proof. And he says there's no need for such a thing because you can see it. You can see it. But as educators, we tend to go for reason and we connect concepts, and that's fine. But there are people who can prove the theorem without getting a sense of what actually is being proven. So it's very interesting. And at the time when I was teaching the course, there's, as AUC often happens, we had this interesting mix of science, social science, and humanities students. And I asked someone, also because I could never do that myself, could you maybe prove the way you can do it, prove the theorem? And he was indeed explaining it in a sort of Euclidean way. And then we talked about, can you also see it? And he said at the time, this is my proof. I can't see it. This is what it means. This is what the theorem is saying. And then some of the humanities students, sorry for this is a stereotype, typical thing. It doesn't make sense, of course, but okay. All of a sudden said, I never got it, but I can see it through the way Schopenhauer explained it.
Oh, interesting.
It was a very, and we laughed, and it was fun. But the point was that the point Schopenhauer was making is that there is a certain visual aspect to the theorem, as to many things that we tend to want to solve conceptually. says someone who's very conceptual. I'm visual a wreck. So, but I thought this was so interesting because it was, I tried to explain it in the article, that there is a sort of build-up in Schopenhauer's thinking from perception to from seeing things, and it very much to a sort of mystical insight. And even compassion is part of this process, in my view. This needs more. This needs more explanation. It's in the text somewhere.
So just as a sort of our concluding section of this interview, I'm very curious. You know, both of our other speakers have talked about their writing process quite a lot, and that Scott talked about his writer's block, basically a very serious one, and how he resolved it. And I'm curious about how you work as a writer. Like, how do you construct an argument like this? Do you sit down and write it all the way through? I sort of doubt it, but maybe you do. What's it like? Right.
Well, yeah, the writer's block thing is, of course, that's such an impressive thing to have, and in that sense, it's a helpful genre to write comments. Maybe also, well, no, it's not lazy. It's more like, okay, some other things can help me on the way. And this was a wonderful chance because I got the invitation to work on it, and I thought, oh, that's marvelous. It's Schopenhauer and Murdoch, so I can connect certain things. It takes a lot of time. I tend to be a procrastinator, but procrastination, I think more and more people see that how useful that can be, because you sort of build up towards a moment where you can, okay, now I'll sit down and then I would maybe write for 20 hours or so.
Oh my God.
No, it's terrible, because then I think, okay, I have to go, and it's very unhealthy. I know students also do it, and I tell them, don't do it.
I didn't know this, really. I sort of knew it, but I didn't know it. Let's say you wrote for 20 hours. Do you then go through a revision process, or when you're writing, are you revising all the while?
Yeah, I keep revising, but I'm finding it difficult to write a sort of outline. I tend to be there's a name for it, the perfect sentence author. You would just I don't want to think, okay, I just skip this and I'll revise later. So I go from sentence to sentence.
You try to get it right, and then you keep.
Wow, and I still keep revising. And of course, the 20 hours is an exaggeration. That's not true. But I tend to at some point think, okay, now I'm really in it, and I think it's very important to keep a full overview of what I'm doing. So I don't want to think, okay, well, then next week I'll write the conclusion, because I want to have the whole thing here, which is why I, in the end, write in a sort of, going on and on.
And then when you send it back to the editors of the volume, do they then send recommendations for revision to you?
Yeah, that's what they did. But yeah, I was very surprised to see that the corrections were very minimal. Yeah, of course, because English is not my mother tongue, and I'm still finding it difficult to write in English. So yeah, you would have to check a lot of things about the English. And of course, even if you know there will be an editor, you don't want to feel awkward about sending in a sort of terrible piece of work. So that also takes a lot of time.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And when you're responding, this is just a question that has to do with teaching and writing. When you're responding to student writers, student papers, what are a couple of the things that you find yourself saying to students? Like this morning, I was responding to students. I found myself trying to help them distinguish between summarizing text, like summarizing Murdoch and Schopenhauer, versus providing a point of view on Schopenhauer and Murdoch. Like that you're like, this is how I think Murdoch is working with Schopenhauer. This is what I think she's doing, versus summarizing what she's doing. Sometimes it can be a very delicate thing. But I wonder whether you find yourself asking the same kinds of questions over and over, or does it just depend on the piece of writing?
That's a very acute question. This morning we had a conversation in the ethics class where one of the students, rightly so, asked, okay, you have this task. I asked him to comment on a certain thing, and she said, you're merely asking us to summarize, and you have a rubric including vision. And I said, that's a good point. Said it's 400 words. We don't even have the time to unfold our vision in such a short piece of work. And then I said, also referring back to an earlier task everyone did, but there's a lot of vision already in summary. Well, maybe not in summarizing, but even there.
Yeah.
But I said, it is a good point, though. It might be more like vision or / level of thought. There's something there.
Yes.
I think that in selecting a certain part of the text, you're doing a lot of visionary work, so to speak. So of course, there is a palette going from description to evaluation or so, or from description to own ideas. But maybe related to the insight that I think fact and value are often connected. I can't always see the difference there, but of course it should be clear to students, which is why we had, I think, an interesting conversation. But I keep in my comments, of course, there's no time to always discuss the writing, although I think that's very important. It's always part of the one rubric, writing style.
Well, right, but we don't think in our course of style as all that we talk about when we talk about writing, right? Like when teachers sit down to comment on the papers that are coming in, they think about thesis, what are you arguing?
Yeah,
why does it matter? Evidence, what are you quoting and discussing? Analysis, structure, how do you structure what you're saying? And then style, right? So these are all the things.
No, because it's one of the,
and I'm sure you do some of this too, but it's really interesting to hear what you're saying, because I think it is so important to think about summary as an interpretation in itself, right? We choose what we choose how to sort of capture what someone said, and we give it a particular inflection, and that's our summary, right? So it's not mere mimicry, or it would be the same thing coming right back at you, right? So each active summary is first an interpretation, and then maybe sometimes we overvalue what we offer ourselves beyond that, right? Maybe it's enough to think carefully about what Murdoch is doing with Schopenhauer and then just kind of highlight it, or we're doing it, as you say, with a kind of a pretty clear angle that you're trying to help people think about it through, right? Your own kind of lens.
And that is also very, I would say, very sort of satisfying to do, because you sort of come to terms with the text. And so going back to what you said about what sort of things do you say to students, that's a very interesting question, because I also see myself returning to certain comments and think, okay, that's a phrase now, and then hopefully think, okay, well, they don't see each other's comments, so it's fine. No, but I would like, I don't know if you and probably the students will recognize this. Sometimes you think this is good work, and it's sometimes very difficult to say why. And then sometimes it's a sort of level of thought, and then it's very difficult to explain why the level of thought is higher than maybe some other work from the same student previously or other students, because marking is in a way comparing, but you have to find a vocabulary for it. And I tend to, maybe that's a very weak thing to say, I tend to say something like that I'm finding it very sophisticated or clear and not pretentious. Things like that, where you find words to say something about it, but it's really difficult to explain, especially if it's not so good, to say, where does it go wrong?
Very helpful, very helpful. I wonder, as we finish here, if you could tell us, as a writer, what is the thing that you find most difficult, and how do you deal with that thing? Like, I would say for myself, for me, the most difficult thing is that it is very hard for me to patiently read enough that I have understood a conversation and I'm ready to enter it. Sometimes I am impatient and I want to be able to say something before I really have digested the other voices that I'm working with. And this is mostly as a literary critic, so that I have to make sure that I'm truly listening. I think Paul Ricoeur calls it sort of a hermeneutics of belief, that you really have to think, okay, what are all these people saying, and what if it is completely true? Like, what is it that I take in? And then we can move to hermeneutics of suspicion, which is, well, and what can I offer here? Like, what if some of it, what can I call into question, or what can I work with here? And for me, the second piece, I sometimes get a little bit eager to do that before I've spent enough time on the first piece, right? So I find that I need to read a little bit more before I start writing. That's my challenge, I would say.
Okay. Yeah, my challenge is exactly opposed to that one.
Good, good.
I tend to postpone. I think I should read more, which is why I was so grateful for being invited. Because of course, in a way, it's maybe better to start writing something and to send it to a journal. I don't often do that, and that's also a pity, because I sometimes think, oh, I should try to publish this. But then there's of course the teaching. We have so many tasks, and there's the marking. So I'll just, well, sometimes they're really nice things. So maybe also as a sort of going back to the start, is a nice composition of the conversation.
Yeah.
I did this translation project, and it was one of the best things in my academic life, to together with a colleague to be in conversation about this text, and to translate it together, and to write 2 essays in the same volume. And with this same colleague, I'm now working on a new project, on an essay from a later essay written by Iris Murdoch on her aesthetic theory. It's a book called The Fire and the Sun, and we are now working on a translation. So I sometimes need those projects together with someone else to actually work on something, to move forward in some sort of publication sense. But I will never be very prolific in that. I tend to postpone. I think I should read more. What do I know? Who's waiting for this?
Very interesting. I like that. I like that we end with this issue of translation. I've so enjoyed our conversation. I just want to thank you. It's a great gift to us and the AWS course to have you speaking with us, all of us, even though some of us aren't talking back right now. So we'll have some conversations now about this conversation.